This happened a few years back. I was going through a particularly stressful time at work, so I decided to get away for a few days and rented a secluded cabin in the mountains. When I finally arrived, the small wooden structure looked cozy enough, nestled amongst the trees with a promising view of the quiet landscape. By nightfall, however, the wind had picked up and snow began to fall, quickly escalating into a full-blown blizzard. I was inside, reading by the crackling fireplace, when a sharp, insistent knocking suddenly shattered the howling silence of the storm. The knocking was distinct, rhythmic, 3 quick raps, a pause, then 3 more. The wind was fierce, buffeting the cabin walls and rattling the windows, so at first, I tried to dismiss it as the storm playing tricks. A branch hitting the door, maybe. But the persistence of the sound, that deliberate pattern, felt undeniably like someone or something was out there. I got up and peered through the peephole, but the swirling snow was so thick it was impossible to see anything beyond a foot or 2. I held my breath, straining to hear over the wind. The knocking stopped for a moment, and I started to think it had been my imagination, the isolation getting to me. But then it started again, louder this time, almost demanding. A knot of cold fear tightened in my chest. Who would be out in this blizzard, knocking on a remote cabin in the middle of nowhere? I retreated to the living room, trying to focus on my book, but the image of someone standing at my door in that terrifying storm kept replaying in my mind. Every gust of wind that slammed against the cabin now sounded like the potential return of that unsettling knock. Then, a new sound cut through the howling wind, sending a fresh wave of icy dread through me. The knocking stopped, replaced by a series of soft, heavy thuds coming from the roof directly above. My eyes snapped upwards. The roof was slanted, covered in what had to be a thick layer of snow. There was absolutely no logical way anything could be up there in this weather. The thudding continued, slow and deliberate, like something heavy was dragging itself across the wooden planks just inches above my head. I stood up, my heart pounding against my ribs. The ceiling began to creak loudly, the old wood groaning under the unseen weight. A fine shower of plaster dust drifted down, landing on the worn rug. The thudding intensified, each impact resonating through the small cabin. It sounded less like walking and more like crawling, something large and heavy, shifting its weight directly above me. I backed away, my eyes glued to the ceiling, half expecting it to cave in. Then, as suddenly as it began, the sounds ceased. The creaking stopped. The thudding was gone. The only sound was the relentless howl of the wind outside. A tense, heavy silence filled the cabin. After what felt like an eternity, the wind seemed to lull momentarily. Driven by a morbid curiosity and a desperate need to understand what had just happened, I bundled up in my warmest clothes and cautiously opened the front door. The world outside was a monochrome landscape of white. The snow was piled high, untouched and pristine. There were no footprints leading to the door, no disturbances in the thick blanket of snow surrounding the cabin. A wave of uneasy relief washed over me. Maybe it had just been the storm. I stepped out onto the porch, the biting wind stinging my face. I wanted to glance up at the roof, though I couldn't imagine seeing anything. But as I turned towards the nearest window, the relief instantly turned to ice-cold terror. Pressed against the outside of the window, stark against the white snow clinging to the glass, was a handprint. It wasn't just any handprint. It was smeared in dark, the distinct outline of fingers and a palm, and the color was undeniably blood red. Without another thought, without even grabbing my coat or belongings, I scrambled to the back door, fumbling with the deadbolt until it finally gave way. I burst out into the swirling snow, the biting wind hitting me like a physical blow. I didn't care about the cold. All I wanted was to get away from that cabin, from that window, from that horrifying mark. I plunged through the deep snow, stumbling and falling, desperate to put distance between myself and the wooden walls that had suddenly become a terrifying trap. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, half buried in a snowdrift. With shaking hands, I clawed at the door handle, yanked it open, and threw myself inside. The engine sputtered and coughed before finally roaring to life. I slammed it into reverse, my tires spinning wildly in the snow, and then lurched forward, blindly following the faint outline of the path I had arrived on. I didn't look back at the cabin, couldn't bring myself to. I drove for hours through the relentless blizzard, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, until I finally reached a small town and the relative safety of a brightly lit diner. Even now, years later, the memory of that bloody handprint on the window haunts me. The pristine white snow, the stark red stain, it replays in my mind with chilling clarity. I never went back to that cabin, and sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I still feel a prickling sensation, a lingering dread that something out there saw me, touched my world, and might still be watching. The solitude of the mountains now carries a permanent shadow of fear. The sudden blizzard hit the Poconos like a switch had been flipped. 1 minute, the late afternoon sun was glinting off the still surface of Lake Harmony. The next, fat, wet snowflakes were swirling, obscuring the view. I'd driven up that morning, eager for a weekend of landscape photography. The rented cabin was perfect, secluded, with huge windows overlooking the water. I'd spent the afternoon setting up my gear, anticipating the soft morning light on the snow-covered scenery. That night, the wind howled like a banshee, rattling the old cabin. I was drifting in and out of sleep when I heard it, a single, distinct crunch of snow outside my bedroom window, followed by a soft, dragging scrape against the wooden wall, near the back of the cabin, away from the path I'd taken to the front door. It sounded heavy, like something solid being pulled along the rough wood. I told myself it was just the storm, branches being dragged by the wind, but the sound was too deliberate, too close. The scraping and occasional soft crunch recurred throughout the night, each time pulling me from the edge of sleep. By morning, the world outside was a white, silent expanse. I got up, the unease from the night clinging to me. Looking out the living room window, the pristine snow was unbroken except for a single set of boot tracks. They led from the treeline directly to the back of the cabin, stopping right beneath the window where I'd heard the scraping. The tracks were deep and uneven, as if whoever made them was struggling or carrying a significant weight. A chill snaked down my spine. I checked all the doors and windows. Every lock was secure from the inside. There were no other tracks anywhere around the cabin, not even near the front door where I'd entered. Someone had been at the back of the cabin, right outside my window, during the height of the storm, and they hadn't approached from the obvious way. Later that morning, the wind finally began to subside, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. That's when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping sound coming from beneath the cabin. The crawl space access was a small, bolted door on the outside foundation. The tapping was slow, deliberate, almost like a coded message being tapped out on wood. A morbid curiosity mixed with a growing sense of dread urged me outside. The snow was thigh-deep in places, the cold seeping through my boots. As I cautiously made my way to the back of the cabin, towards the crawl space door, I noticed a dark stain on the otherwise untouched snow, right near the door's edge. It was small but unmistakable dried blood. The tapping stopped the moment I saw it. My breath hitched. Whatever was making that sound, whatever had been outside my window, might be injured. Or worse. I didn't dare open the crawl space. I retreated inside, locking the back door behind me. I moved to a different window, one that offered a view towards the edge of the woods where the tracks had begun. Through the swirling remnants of the snow, I caught a fleeting glimpse of a tall, dark figure standing perfectly still between the trees. It was partially obscured by the falling snow in the distance, but its unnatural stillness, the way it seemed to be watching the cabin, sent a jolt of pure fear through me. I blinked, and it was gone. Just a trick of the light and snow, I tried to tell myself, but the image was burned into my mind. The tapping from the crawl space started again, this time louder, more frantic, as if whatever was down there was desperate. Then, a sound that made my blood run cold. A violent bang from the back door, followed by the sickening splintering of wood. The flimsy cabin door was giving way. Panic seized me. I stumbled backward as the door crashed inward, and a figure stumbled into the room. It wasn't the tall, dark shape I'd seen in the woods. This person was smaller, completely soaked, and looked utterly disoriented. They reached out a trembling hand towards me, their eyes wide with raw terror, and whispered a single chilling word. "Help, they're still out there," before collapsing onto the floor unconscious. My mind raced. They? Who else was out there? As I instinctively moved towards the fallen stranger, my gaze flickered back to the broken doorway. Standing just a few feet away, framed by the splintered wood and swirling snow, was the tall, dark figure from the woods. It was closer now, and I could see its face, or rather what covered it. A crude, grotesque mask made of bark, with empty, black holes where the eyes should have been. It raised a hand, and in it, it held a long, sharpened piece of wood. Adrenaline surged through me. There was no time to think. I lunged towards a side window, smashing it with the heel of my boot. Ignoring the shards of glass, I scrambled out into the deep snow, desperately dragging the unconscious stranger with me. The snow was relentless, slowing our escape. I struggled towards the frozen lake, praying the ice would hold our weight. Behind me, I could hear the soft thump-thump-thump of heavy footsteps in the snow. I glanced back and saw the masked figure slowly following, its movements eerily silent despite the deep drifts. I finally reached the other side of the lake and stumbled towards what looked like another, larger vacation home in the distance. It was empty, but I managed to find a phone and call for help. The person I'd tried to rescue never regained consciousness. The authorities searched the area for days but found no trace of the masked figure or any other tracks besides the single set leading to my cabin. To this day, the memory of that bark-masked face, those empty black holes staring in my direction, haunts my waking hours. The stranger's dying words echo in my mind. They're still out there. Who were they? What did they want? I avoid isolated places now, and every time I see a treeline in the distance, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching, waiting in the shadows. The silence of the woods no longer brings peace, only a chilling, persistent dread. It was the kind of blizzard that swallowed sound. The wind howled, but it was a muffled howl, like the mountain itself was sighing under a thick blanket of white. I'd driven up to this isolated cabin a few days before, chasing the raw beauty of a winter storm for my photography. The forecast had hinted at heavy snow, but this was bordering on apocalyptic. Now, the small wooden structure felt less like a scenic retreat and more like a lonely outpost under siege. The first day of the heavy snow was exhilarating. I spent hours bundled up, capturing the swirling chaos outside, the way the snow plastered itself against the pines, turning them into ghostly figures. But as the storm intensified and dragged into the second day, a subtle unease began to creep in. The silence between the gusts became heavier, and the cabin, though sturdy, started to feel small. That's when I first heard it, a faint creaking sound from above. This was a one-story cabin with a simple A-frame roof. The only space above me was the small, unfinished attic, accessible by a pull-down ladder in the hallway. I'd glanced up there when I first arrived. It was dusty and empty, just bare beams and insulation. I dismissed the sound as the house settling in the extreme cold. Old wood does that. But later that evening, as the wind momentarily died down, I heard it again. A distinct thump, thump, thump. It sounded like someone or something was walking up there. My breath hitched. Animals? Maybe a squirrel had somehow gotten in. I went to the hallway and stared at the closed attic hatch. It had a simple latch, and I was sure I'd left it secured. I grabbed a chair and carefully pulled the ladder down. Dust motes danced in the beam of my flashlight as I peered into the darkness. Nothing. Just the sloping roof, the insulation, and a thick layer of undisturbed dust. No tracks, no signs of life. I pushed the ladder back up, a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. The wind picked up again, its mournful cry almost masking the unsettling sounds from above. But they were still there, intermittent and soft, like hesitant footsteps. The next day, the footsteps became more frequent, more distinct. They'd start in one corner of the attic, move slowly across the length of the ceiling above me, and then stop. Sometimes, There would be a dragging sound, like something heavy was being pulled across the floorboards. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the wind was somehow causing vibrations that sounded like footsteps. But the rhythm, the deliberate pauses, it felt undeniably like something moving. Sleep became a luxury I could barely afford. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the windows, was amplified by the constant, subtle movements above me. I'd lie in bed, straining to hear, my heart pounding in my chest. Then came the night the footsteps stopped. A profound silence descended upon the cabin, more unsettling than the sounds had been. I lay there, wide awake, listening to the blizzard rage outside, the absence of the attic sounds creating a vacuum of dread. Suddenly, a series of sharp, frantic bangs erupted from directly above me. It sounded like someone was pounding on the attic floor, directly over my bed. I jolted upright, my blood running cold. Whatever was up, there was no longer being subtle. Fear propelled me out of bed. I grabbed a heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace, my hand trembling. I had to know what was in that attic. I dragged the chair back to the hallway, my gaze fixed on the attic hatch. With a surge of adrenaline, I yanked the ladder down and, poker raised, started to climb. The air in the small attic was frigid and thick with dust. My flashlight beam danced across the bare beams and the snow seeping through gaps in the roof. Nothing. Utterly empty. Except, my light caught a set of footprints in the snow that had accumulated on the attic floor. They were small, almost childlike, and they led from the far corner of the attic, across the dusty boards, and then stopped abruptly in the middle of the space. There were no other prints, no way they could have gotten up here without leaving a trail in the undisturbed dust near the hatch. I lowered the poker, a wave of confusion washing over the terror. How could there be footprints in the snow inside the attic, with no other tracks leading to them? The blizzard finally began to subside the next morning. The rescue snowplow arrived mid-afternoon, the rumble of its engine a welcome sound after days of isolation and fear. I recounted my experience to the driver, a burly man with a skeptical expression. He just shrugged, attributing the sounds to the storm and the old house settling. I didn't argue. What could I say? That there were phantom footsteps in an empty attic? I packed my gear quickly, eager to leave the oppressive atmosphere of the cabin behind. As I drove away, the image of that pale face lingered in my mind, a silent, unsettling question mark hanging in the rearview mirror. Back home, a few days later, I finally got around to reviewing the photos I'd taken of the storm and the cabin. Scrolling through the images, I paused on a wide shot of the snow-covered cabin, taken just before the full force of the blizzard hit. And that's when I saw it. In the small, square window of the attic, a window that shouldn't have even existed on the single-story structure. There was a faint, pale face pressed against the glass, looking directly at the camera. My blood ran cold. The attic wasn't just empty, it wasn't even a proper room. Yet there it was, captured in the digital image, a silent witness to the terror I had felt within those walls. The footsteps, the pounding, they suddenly took on a horrifying new dimension. I deleted the photo, but the image is forever burned into my memory, a chilling reminder of something unseen that shared that isolated cabin with me.